If you turn back the clock this weekend, back 101 years ago, 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail on its first voyage. And only voyage. It would hit the iceberg and go down in the early morning hours of April 15th. I'm not going to get into the history because I've got the expert in the studio. Rob Catalano is with us, who is a Titanic enthusiast, public speaker, and also is involved in a big play that is starting, I believe, tonight. And we're going to talk all about that. He got his interest and start in Titanic up at the Great Lakes Science Center years ago. But, Rob, thanks for coming in this morning. We appreciate you making time.
Thanks for having me in, Ray.
And we'll also open up some phone lines for you folks in just a little bit. If you have any questions pertaining to certainly the mysteries and the stories of the RMS Titanic. Take us back to the launch of the Titanic and the night it goes down and hits the iceberg. It's well documented. Is there anything of that night that we really don't know about that you can share with us, Rob?
Well, what's really interesting about that night, most people don't realize, is maybe they would have thought the weather conditions were very bad and the Titanic was in rough seas and that's why they couldn't see the iceberg. But as a matter of fact, it was completely opposite. It was a really unusual night to be in the mid-Atlantic back in April 14th, 1912, because the sea was perfectly calm. It was almost as smooth as glass, which the sailors who had been sailing for 25, 30 years had never seen anything like it. And one of the things about sailing and looking for icebergs is the easiest way to see it is to see the wake of the waves at the base of the iceberg, because it creates froth that you can see from quite a distance. Not only that, there was no moon that night. There were brilliant stars, but no moon. It was perfectly calm. And so that's what really made it very difficult for the lookouts to see that iceberg in time.
Did they have their binoculars or not?
They didn't, and that's an interesting story. So everything about
both sides of this.
Yeah, everything about the Titanic has to do with so many unusual circumstances coming together, unfortunately, at the same time to cause it to hit the iceberg. And one of the funny things that happened was these were new class ships. This was an Olympic class ship, which means the first ship, the Olympic, had been launched or set sail on its maiden voyage the year before. So Titanic was the second of 3 ships in the Olympic class, and these ships were so large, it was hard to get sailors who really knew how to operate them. So they actually decided to bring some of the officers from the Olympic onto Titanic for the maiden voyage, just for their experience. And on the very day they were to sail, April 10th, 1912, they decided to bring the chief officer from Olympic on board, and his name was Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wild. So they did that the day she sailed, which bumped the original chief officer, First Officer Murdoch, down to first officer. Then the first officer, Charles Herbert Lightoller, was bumped down to second officer, and the second officer, Davy Blair, was booted off the ship altogether.
Okay.
So when he was booted off the ship, he forgot to leave the key to the safe that was in his quarters. And what was in the safe? Binoculars.
Wow.
But here's the thing. Even if they had binoculars, that's not how you look for an iceberg. Because if you think about it, if you're looking at the vast expanse of the ocean and you're looking for this white image off in the distance somewhere, if you have binoculars, you're only going to see a very small part of the ocean at a time. So you're going to use your bare eyes, and then if you wanted to verify what you saw, then you would use the binoculars. But the fact of the matter is, they were only about 2 ship lengths away from the iceberg before they struck it, which only gave them 37 seconds to take action.
Wow, that is a short period of time for
Absolutely,
that big. But they almost missed it, didn't they?
They almost. So First Officer Murdoch was actually in the bridge at the time, and so he ordered the wheel hard to starboard and full astern, which basically means, even though hard to starboard, that means to turn to the left, because you had to turn the wheel the opposite way. And hard astern basically means put on the brakes. So he put on the brakes and tried to turn away from the iceberg, but unfortunately, because of the way the ship was propelled, it had 2 wing screws on the outside and 1 in the center. The center propeller was actually run by a turbine, and that turbine could not go in reverse. So because of all of these new things about the way the ship operated, there wasn't enough power to drive the rudder to turn the ship fast enough. So if he hadn't have ordered that, the hard astern, maybe they would have missed it altogether.
Very interesting. Titanic expert, enthusiast, public speaker, Rob Catalano is in our studio. And you mentioned the name Charles Lightoller. You know him very well.
Yes, I do. And that's really
that's where it all started.
That's where it started, because when I went to the Great Lakes Science Center in 2002 and they asked me to be part of the exhibition, they said, "We'd like you to be a character. We don't care who it is as long as it's an officer." So I researched the officers a little bit, and I discovered upon this gentleman who had an amazing life. So he not only survived the Titanic disaster, he was the highest ranking officer. So he was the one who was grilled during the hearings in both Washington, D.C. and then back in London. And this guy had been sailing on the ocean since he was 13 years old. He started with the tall ships. He sailed all around the world. He sailed with the White Star Line. He sailed after the Titanic disaster. He was a hero in World War I and in World War II.
Wow.
It's just an amazing person to play.
All right. Now, Rob, this has taken us full circle, and I mentioned at the outset a play starting tonight going through the 27th, and it's called The Pilots of the Purple Twilight. Give details of the play and where it is and such.
Well, believe it or not, Pilots of the Purple Twilight is actually a comedic drama, or a dramedy, if you would, and it's set in the first-class smoking lounge of the Titanic on the very night that it sinks, about 10 minutes before it strikes the iceberg. And so you can imagine it's the first-class smoking lounge. So I play Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, who was the richest man, presumably in the world at the time, definitely on board the ship. Isidore Strauss, you've probably heard about him. He's on board. And there's other characters, including some people who probably would never have been in the first-class smoking lounge. But the playwright, Steve Kluger, took some creative license, and he took a lot of facts and half-truths and kind of blended them into a very rich story that tells about perspectives of people on board that ship, why they were traveling, and what got them onto Titanic, what was life like at that time, how did the classes mix. So it's very funny, it's very poignant, there's some very intense scenes in it as well, and we have just a fantastic cast directed by Brian Westerly. So it actually opens tonight. Showtimes are at 7:30. It's at the Broadview Heights Spotlights Theater, and the phone number is 440-526-4404, and we're also online at broadviewheightsspotlights.org. So it runs today through April 27th, and there's a matinee on Sunday, April 21st as well.
In our studio, Rob Catalano, RMS Titanic enthusiast, public speaker, expert, I will say, and we're talking about the Titanic. He's in a new play that is opening up tonight, as a matter of fact, Pilots of the Purple Twilight. Titanic set sail this date back in 1912 and went down on the early morning hours of April 15th. If you do have a question about the Titanic, Rob said he'd be happy to answer some questions at 330-370-1590. Good morning on WAKR. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, Ray. I appreciate your show this morning with this gentleman. I have basically two questions.
Go ahead.
And I'll try not to convolute them. Has the federal court in Virginia ruled on who owns the property with the Titanic? And my query is, why is a U.S. court ruling on the possessions if the boat truly went down in Canadian Nova Scotia waters?
Very good question.
Very good question. You know what? I'm not the legal expert on that matter, but there is a lot of controversy about bringing any artifacts up from Titanic at all. There's basically two camps on that. One is, if you don't, then everything's going to be lost to history. Other people say that it's a grave site. So I really can't answer that specific question about the legal matters going on right now. And I thought it was in international waters, but it is 2.5 miles deep. So pretty much, if you're going to go down there, you need to have all kinds of special equipment. It costs millions of dollars to run any expedition. So there's a question of, if you're going to spend that money and bring things up, who really has the rights to it? I don't know. For example, the artifact exhibitions that are around the country and around the world, various people own that. But basically, my understanding is the only organization that has rights to any of the Titanic artifacts is the Titanic International Titanic, I can't remember the exact name, but there is a group that was formed, and they're the only ones who are supposed to have the rights to the artifacts.
Do they make trips down to the Titanic a lot during the course of the year or not?
You mean every year? No, because it's so expensive to do that.
I know.
Yeah, and there have been quite a few expeditions since Dr. Ballard found it, but really they're very few and very far between. And again, I'm sorry, I can't really answer the legal questions. I'm not aware of all that.
That's fine. Okay, those notables on board, and I remember talking to you in the past, yes, there were some Akron ties to the Titanic, but get into some of the personalities that were on board. Maybe you can start off with some of the Akron ties.
Yeah, actually, there were some people, there were only about a dozen people coming to Akron. Some of them were coming here for the first time because, of course, with the industry that was building in the Midwest. As a matter of fact, most of the passengers that were coming to emigrate to the United States were coming to the Great Lakes area because this is where the jobs were. So about of the dozen people coming to the Akron area, I'd say 3 or 4 of them were coming here for jobs. I think the rest of them belonged to a group called they were either the Hawkins family or the Richards family, and it was headed by Mrs. William Hawking, and she had 2 sons, Richard and Sidney, who lived in Akron, and she decided to join them. So Richard traveled back to England to escort his mother to Ohio, and they were accompanied with Eliza's sister, Ellen Wilkes, and siblings Richards and William Richards, and Richard Hawking managed to get his mother, aunt, and cousins into lifeboat number 4, and they all survived, but Richard didn't. And when they arrived in New York, Sidney Hawking met his family and took them to Ohio.
Okay.
So that's probably the most interesting group because there was a whole family situation going on there.
Okay, now in this play, you portray Colonel John Jacob Astor, who was the richest man on board the Titanic. So talk a little bit about Astor, and then maybe into some of the other notables on board.
Right. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV was a fascinating character. Not only was he the 4th, but his father was not the 3rd, so they actually jumped a generation there as far as the names. But the reason he was traveling on Titanic is he and his wife had been having some problems, and he ended up getting divorced. Now, that is really a big, big taboo back in a high society back in 1912. And not only did he get divorced, but he went and married an 18-year-old girl called Madeline. So to avoid this scandal, when they got married, they went over to Europe for an extended honeymoon until all the hullabaloo died down. And while they were there, they actually hooked up with Mrs. Margaret J.J. Brown. Some of you might know her as Molly Brown, even though she never went by the name Molly in her lifetime.
The unsinkable Molly Brown.
She never had that nickname in her lifetime. It wasn't until the book and the play came out. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So they were traveling in Europe for an extended honeymoon, and they decided to come on the Titanic because Madeline got pregnant during their honeymoon, and she was 5 months pregnant. They were traveling around with Margaret J.J. Brown. They even went to places like Egypt. And one of the funny stories is he was traveling with his pet dog, Kitty, who was an Airedale. And she was a beautiful, beautiful dog. And Astor was very devoted to her. And in Egypt, when they were taking a trip down the Nile, Kitty actually got lost. And they spent days and thousands of dollars putting out notices and rewards to find her. And they finally found her.
Wow.
And so when he got back on board the Titanic, where they boarded in Cherbourg, France, he didn't want to let Kitty out of his sight, basically. But they basically made him keep her in the kennels, except for when they were walking her on the deck. But he was so devoted to that dog. And actually, the last memory that people have is of him. Madeline actually saw him from the lifeboat walking with Kitty on the deck, and unfortunately they both went down with the ship.
Very interesting. Okay, now the builder of the ship was also on board. In the movie, they portray him as knowing this thing's going to go down right away. Talk about the builder and the designer of the ship.
Right. The ship was actually built by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and the Olympic-class ships were the pride of that town because they were just the most magnificent things that people had ever seen in their lives. It was the largest moving object ever in the history at that time. So the actual designer of the ship was Thomas Andrews, and he was on board as part of a guarantee group. There were 9 people from Harland and Wolff. And also, the Titanic was operated by the White Star Line, which was managed by J. Bruce Ismay, and that in turn was owned by the International Mercantile Marine, who was owned by J.P. Morgan. So what people don't know is the Titanic was actually an American ship, but it had a British crew.
Wow.
So J. Bruce Ismay was on board, and the funny thing is J.P. Morgan was supposed to be on board the maiden voyage of Titanic, but depending on who you believe, he either got sick or he was spending extended time in Europe with his mistress.
Oh.
So he missed the boat. So his luxurious quarters went to J. Bruce Ismay instead. And Ismay was traveling just as a passenger. He wasn't there as an official representative of White Star, but it was kind of a tradition for him to go on the maiden voyage of all the ships. So he was on board, Thomas Andrews was on board, and then the rest of the guarantee group from Harland and Wolff. And so when the ship struck the iceberg, one of the first things that they did was get Thomas Andrews and went down to survey the damage. And Thomas Andrews knew that ship inside and out. And he saw immediately when there was that 300-foot gash, and at least 4 of the compartments originally had been breached, and it later was more, he knew that ship only had about 2 hours or so to go down. He timed it almost to the minute.
Why were there not enough lifeboats? Were they in a hurry to get this thing out? Did it take up too much space up on deck? I've heard a lot of stories pertaining to this.
What do you mean there weren't enough lifeboats? The British Board of Trade only required 16, and Titanic had 20, for goodness sake. So they had more than enough lifeboats. But unfortunately, at that time, British law and maritime law was not keeping up with how big the ships were. So an example is the Titanic. The next biggest ship before Titanic and Olympic was the Mauretania and Lusitania by the rival Cunard lines. Titanic was 42% bigger than those ships. So, and those were big ships. So you can imagine how much bigger she was from the traditional ships of the day. So because she had watertight compartments, they didn't require her to carry enough lifeboats for everybody on board, but she went and exceeded it by 4 lifeboats. So if the ship was fully loaded, she'd actually have enough lifeboats for about a third of the crew. Now, on the maiden voyage, she wasn't full of passengers. She was about 1,000 people shy on passengers, so they actually had enough room for about half of the people who were on board at the time. Now, they were going to put on more lifeboats because they knew the British Board of Trade was going to change the law soon. So they actually developed the davits, which are basically the winches that lower the lifeboats. They designed them to hold more, but you're exactly right. J. Bruce Ismay and the White Star Line felt the passengers would prefer to have an unobstructed view of the ocean, so they only put on enough lifeboats and a few more than what they really needed, thinking they put lifeboats on later when the law changed.
In our studio, certainly appreciate him making time with us, is Rob Catalano. Rob is a RMS Titanic enthusiast, public speaker, actor. I guess I could throw that in there. They have a new play on the Titanic opening up tonight at the Broadview Heights Spotlights Theater. It's called Pilots of the Purple Twilight. What's the gist of the play again, Rob?
Gist of the play is it's set in the first-class smoking lounge, and it starts about 10 minutes before the Titanic strikes the iceberg. And what happens through the course of events is people come into the smoking lounge who really wouldn't be there normally, but the playwright wanted to create dramatic and comedic effect. So, for example, Colonel Astor is there, which we spoke about earlier, along with Isidore Strauss, and then his wife comes in. And his wife would never come into the first-class smoking lounge, but these were unusual circumstances. Then another group that comes in is actually a brother and sister by the name of Charlie and Alice Fortune, and they're traveling with their family. They're going back to Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and they're, well, at least Charlie is an inspiring actor, so there's a whole subplot with there. And I do want to say the young woman who plays Alice Fortune, Kaylee Joyce, she just brings a wonderful spark to the entire show, so I wanted to give her a special mention, because if I didn't, she said she'd break my arm, so I had to do that.
At least you've got your ducks in a row.
That's
there,
right.
My friend. Good conversation about the history of the Titanic. Set sail this date back in 1912 and was down at the bottom of the ocean by the early morning hours of April 15th. Of 1912. Rob Catalano is with us. He's a Titanic enthusiast, speaker, actor, and certainly knows everything you can think about the Titanic. If you have a question for him, 330-370-1590, 330-370-1590. How much blame goes at the feet of Captain Smith?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Captain Smith actually was set to retire from the White Star Line after Titanic's maiden voyage, although he might have come when the next sister ship in the Olympic series, the Gigantic, later named the Britannic, was going to set sail. So this was a very special event for him. He had been captain of the Olympic, which is the sister ship that had been sailing since the year before. Now, here's the thing. Yes, you might say he was going too fast. You might say they disregarded ice warnings. You might say, why didn't they do the lifeboat drills they were supposed to do? There's a lot of things. But the fact of the matter is, when they did the hearings in the U.S. and in England afterwards, other captains and other ship owners basically said he didn't do anything differently than any other captain would have done in that day and age. And that's because everybody at that time thought technology could overcome anything that nature can throw at it. So that's why they called her practically unsinkable. And as we know, nothing is unsinkable, especially with some of the modern events that we've had in the last few years. So people actually in the day didn't really blame Captain Smith. As a matter of fact, he was a hero back in England, and there are memorials to him all over the place. So the person who was really vilified was J. Bruce Ismay, who not only was on board the Titanic, but he had the gall to survive as a first-class passenger and got into a boat that was, not even completely full. So, and he was the one who designed the boat. He was the one who made the decisions not to have all the lifeboats on there because they didn't think they needed them, because they didn't think it would sink and it would, obstruct the view. So he was the one that was vilified, especially in America. Now, in England, he wasn't as much vilified, but afterwards, he was so distraught about the whole Titanic disaster. Of course, he retired from White Star. He became a hermit, and you could never say the word Titanic in his presence ever again.
Was there pressure on Captain Smith to make this a very fast voyage in regards to the speed?
Now, here's the thing. Some people think that Titanic was trying to break the speed record for crossing westward on the Atlantic Ocean, but that would never happen because that record was held by the Cunard's Mauritania, and the Cunard ships were built for speed. The White Star ships were built for power and luxury, and while they were fast, they weren't quite as fast as the Cunard lines. Now, some people think, and there's no real proof of this, is just by J. Bruce Ismay's presence on board the ship, he was kind of subconsciously influencing Captain Smith to beat the record of the Olympic during her maiden voyage. So she would be faster than her sister ship. She's slightly larger than her sister ship. So that's a possibility. So when she hit the iceberg, as far as miles per hour, she was probably going about 25 or so.
With us in our studios, Rob Catalano talking about the Titanic. 330-370-1590 is the number to call. 330-370-1590. Watching the older movie on the Titanic with Barbra Streisand and Robert Wagner. Forget the name of the film. I'm sure you know the name of the film.
Barbara Stanwyck?
Barbara Stanwyck, yeah.
That was just called Titanic.
Okay,
also.
Titanic. And then when you see the newer movie, Titanic, two different. When the ship goes down in the older movie, they show it going down completely different than the new movie Titanic. And I see you brought the model with you. Talk about with me how the Titanic went down and how we know it went down the way it did.
Well, there was a lot of confusion when the hearings happened in Washington and then in England afterwards. And the main person who testified and who had the most authority was Second Officer Lightoller, the person that I played. Now, unfortunately, when Second Officer Lightoller was going down with the ship, he literally was sucked into a ventilation shaft. And so he was actually underwater going down with Titanic when a blast of air blew him back up to the surface. And that didn't happen once, it happened twice. And then once he got back up to the surface again, there was an upside-down lifeboat that was nearby he had been trying to launch. He swam over to that. So basically, he was either underwater or his back was turned as the ship was going down. So he testified the ship went down intact. But other people testified, and I think it was Jack Thayer, who was a first-class passenger, even drew a drawing of it showing it splitting in half. So a lot of passengers said that, but because of Lightoller's testimony, they said she went down intact. Now, it wasn't until Dr. Ballard went down and found the wreck, in the 80s, that they actually discovered it sitting on the ocean floor 2.5 miles down with the bow and the stern separated and facing away from each other. Now, the reason she broke in half is just like a large bridge, like the Golden Gate Bridge, the steel has to be made so it's flexible, so it can flex based on weather conditions. So there was an expansion joint in the Titanic as well, and this one happened to be between the third and the fourth funnel. So as she was going down at the bow, she was going from port to starboard, listing back and forth, and finally, when enough weight when it was pulling down, enough weight was still in the stern where some of the engine equipment was, that expansion joint just gave way, and she basically broke apart like a banana peel. And so it was a thin strip holding the two sections together, and then as she went down, it broke apart.
There you go. Good morning on WAKR. Go ahead with your question for Mr. Catalano.
Good morning. Why are ships always referred to as she?
Well, it's because I think basically you want the crew to have a connection with the ship. And, of course, up until modern times, the crew was always a male crew. So they had that bond, which is why they also had the figures of the maiden on front of the ships, too. So they can make that personal connection with the ship.
All right. Thanks for the phone call. 330-370-1590 if you do have a question. Rob, before we wrap up our conversation this morning, again, your play starts tonight. It goes until the 27th. Quick overview on how people can get out to see it.
Right. You can get out to see it at the Broadview Heights Spotlights Theater, and I believe Ray's going to put some of the information on the website. So we still have some tickets available tonight, but it's selling fast, so I recommend calling the number. Then the play basically is set on board the first-class smoking lounge of the Titanic, and it starts about 10 minutes before she strikes the iceberg, and it really is a comedic dramedy. So we had our preview audience last night, and there were laughs in places we didn't have any idea there were going to be laughs. So if you want to see a cross-section of people who are on board, this is the play to see.
Okay, we have time for one more caller. Good morning on WAKR. Go ahead.
Good morning. This is very interesting. I have a painting that I feel like might be representing the ballroom of the Titanic. It's a picture of an orchestra in their tuxes, and then a bunch of people dancing that are in peasant dress like they might have been in steerage, and I think I read where sometimes in the late hours they come up and dance. Would you know of anyone that could look at it and tell me if that's the case?
Well, I can probably tell you that it probably wasn't. Well, you said it's a painting, so there was no actual ballroom or dancing area on the Titanic, although people in steerage, and I would call it third class, there was no steerage on board Titanic, for goodness sake.
Oh, okay.
So people in third class did have room to dance. They had, I believe, had a piano down there, but there was no dancing facility, so it was probably another ship similar to Titanic. But what I would do is go to a website, Titanic.com is one of them, or Encyclopedia Titanica is another one, and those would be good places to start to put that question out there in one of the chat boards.
Rob, thanks for coming down. Really good information, great insight, educational, and I think the listeners enjoyed the conversation as well. Good luck with the play. It goes until the 27th, and thanks for coming on down this morning.
Right. Thanks, Roy.
There you go. Rob Catalano with us in our studio, RMS Titanic enthusiast and public speaker with us. He'll be playing Colonel Astor in Pilots of the Purple Twilight starting tonight at the Broadview Heights Spotlights Theater.